If you run a team in your business or in the company you work for, you as a leader are going to be the big influencer on that team dynamic and how it comes together. So in today's episode, we're going to dive into that, and we'll be right back.
You're listening to Leadership Powered by Common Sense with your host, Doug Thorpe. Here's Doug.
Hello again, everyone. You're listening to Leadership Powered by Common Sense. I am your host, Doug Thorpe, and today we are going to dive into the direct impact a leader can have on creating the right dynamic inside their team. My guest is Candice Gottlieb-Clark. Candice, welcome to the show.
Well, thank you so much for having me, Doug. It's a pleasure to be here today.
She is a specialist in this field, and as we've kind of built up to doing this show and both talking in the green room before we went online here, I think she's got some great ideas and thoughts about how you as a leader can impact the very dynamics that your team will exhibit. So Candice has kind of become a tradition on this show. Give us a quick backstory first of how you got to where you are right now.
Okay, thanks, Doug. Well, my background in coming into the world of business is with a background in counseling and psychology. And I spent about the first 10 years of my career working in those fields and always having a passion that began much younger for making the workplace better. In other words, making it a place where people who spend their, majority of their waking hours really involved find it to be a powerful, successful, important part of their life, not just one that pays the bills. And it took me a little while to find my footing on that, but I ended up learning about the world of mediation and conflict resolution as a field that was not isolated to just the legal profession. I learned about that back in the year 2000, so now 22 years ago, and it was at Love at First Learn. And so I ended up forming a practice about 2 years later. I immediately dove into the field, but 2 years later formed my own business, and it focused on healing conflicts in the workplace. In other words, helping individuals that have conflicts to resolve them so that the people that they're having issues with became more of a comrade than a source of conflict for them. And it really was so powerful and so wonderful. And that world just kind of expanded a lot of other opportunities for me to impact the business, that including being able to help leaders in recognizing where they can have an impact, which is a lot of what we'll probably talk about today, but also helping people through that lens to form better teams and to create a better organization as a whole by shifting the culture, by all these different aspects, because they all interweave into what a world of work is. And it's just something I feel so powerfully is so powerfully important, and I'm so passionate about it. So I formed my company around those ideals and with that knowledge and grew it to where it is today.
Well, great. And congratulations on that. And you have a new book, I believe. Let's talk about that real quick.
Thank you. Yes, I wrote a book that came out earlier this year called Find, Fix, Fill Your Leadership Gap. And I wrote it because I have had the privilege of coming into organizations when they are experiencing crisis, when they're telling me things that are highly protected and confidential and frightening for the organization if this information was to be leaked. But I would have the privilege of going in there and helping these organizations not only to resolve that issue, but to figure out what caused it, which, snapshot of what we're going to talk about is a lot of it comes back to the leader. And something I came across very early on after recognizing things kept coming back to the leader and being in that very unfortunate position of having to then tell said leader that they were part of the problem, I began asking leaders, hey, if I learn once we start working on this, that some of it stems back to you, how would you like me to let you know? And almost without exception, I get a self-deprecating laugh and this, this warmth in response to saying, oh, of course it's going to come back to me. Just tell me. And of course, that made it so easy. I would then have that meeting with the leader, whatever number of weeks or months later, and say, do you remember that initial conversation we had where I suggested if there was a time? And then they'll say, okay, lay it on me. And it told me how much leaders really want to do the best they can for their teams. They sometimes just lack the awareness. And so in writing my book, it was a way of expanding that awareness to people beyond their own realm, beyond their own current base of knowledge, because I use stories that I've worked on with clients to explain all the different ways these things tend to happen so that any leader can pick it up, or aspiring leader, and learn what are the core competencies they need to do, what are the things they need to change, and how can they transform their leadership so that they can transform their teams.
You know, I'm reminded of the quote from John Maxwell that says, if you think you're a leader and you don't have followers, you're just walking around. And I think that's so true. And there's nothing disrespectful about the notion that anyone in a position of leadership, if you look immediately to the team they have, and if that team is not aligned or is suffering dissension and dysfunction, then it is ultimately that leader's responsibility to figure that out and try to influence the outcome in a different way. And that is such a big challenge. You know, in bigger business, managers get appointed, they get moved around, they get transferred into operating units, and they often inherit a team. Right. So they're not, unlike the entrepreneur who gets to pick their team, straight out of the gate and on an ongoing basis. Bigger business leaders often inherit their teams. So let's kind of start there. Let's talk about what is someone to do if I'm a leader, I just got transferred halfway around the world to take on a new business unit. I meet my team and I quickly find out there's a bunch of infighting and a bunch of dissatisfaction. What do you encourage us to do with that?
Awesome question. And I'm so glad you asked. There are things that a leader can do just as effectively when they're walking into a situation as they can do when they realize that they've created the problematic situation. In fact, in some ways, it's easier if you're walking into it. I think the biggest mistake, I'll start with that before I shift it to what to do about it, is to ignore the problem and to think that you can just say, we're going to start fresh. This is a new ship. I'm the new captain and we're all good. That does nothing to change the trajectory of where people are at, because whatever problems they had still exist, even if there's a new leader. They haven't been able to brush those aside. And it's very rare that a team recognizes specifically that it's the leader's style or behaviors or decision-making that have led to the conflict. They often have infighting because they believe it's other people in the company. And it's brought about by things as simple as too much confidentiality or in the wrong places to have confidentiality. And so when a new leader were to walk in, the first thing they should do is to say, my goal is to create a cohesive, collaborative environment. And I know it's not here today. And we are going to start by my getting to know each of you. And a leader needs to do that. And I'll come back to that for just a moment, in just a moment. But they need to say, I want to understand what is working, what isn't working, what teams exist. And then I want to let you know that I'm going to shift things by changing the way we develop trust on our team. And I speak a lot about trust in my book and what it takes to develop trust. But because a leader that's listening today may say, well, I can't possibly get to know everybody on my team. There's 48 people reporting to me. I want to say this. I read a book that is another phenomenal book on the 9 Lies of Leadership. And it is by Ashley Goodall and, I always forget one of the 2 authors, Marcus Buckingham. And it's a really terrific read. And it really was surprising to me because it challenged my thinking, which is always a good book to read, right? And he talks about in the book, there's a part where he talks about how to manage properly. And a manager can only manage, and this is at any level of an organization. There are always people that report to you, people that you can check in with at least once a week. If you cannot have one-on-one time with each person at least once a week, you have too many people reporting to you and you need a different structure. And I won't go into further detail about that, but that is where I'm coming from when I say they need to meet with each individual, find out what's working for them, find out where their passions are, find out what's working, and not necessarily to resolve their issues at that point, but then to start working on the building trust.
Yeah. That is so huge. And as you and I have shared, I too have a passion for talking about trust in the workplace. And the often what I'll refer to is the fact that when someone sits in a box on the org chart, there's a certain level of power bestowed to that box. And the best leader uses that positional power as the absolute last resort, but rather they should use their own leadership skill to bring the team together, set the vision, set the course, and work for that culture of collaboration and support and coordination among all the team members. And I've had a whole campaign going this year in my coaching business. I said I want to make 2022 the year of better bosses, because as the HR phrase goes, people join companies, but they quit bosses. And if the boss is not doing a good job at building that team environment, handling those flashpoints when they bubble up between two team members, you're going to have a long-term problem there. So let's jump on over to that scenario. It sounds like a lot of your work is on that. I'll use the phrase bad boss scenario, the guy who has maybe created some of these tensions and some of this dysfunction. Where do you start trying to work on that?
Well, I look at, and so much of what you said calls exactly to my book. And yet I think because my lens is different, I have a different way of working with individuals for these purposes. And so I look at leadership as having a three-legged stool, with each being so super important that if any of them is weak, the other two will immediately start to crumble. And the three-legged stool includes trust, role clarity, and conflict management. And I want to talk about role clarity first, because it was something you were just referring to, and it spoke to me so deeply. We talk about that original org chart, right? And we think of it as a top down. And I talk about it in my book as a bottom up, like inverting that pyramid, inverting that triangle, because ultimately any leader's responsibility is to take care of all the people above them. They have the weight of all of those people on them, relying on their leadership, relying on their knowledge and willingness to share that knowledge, their ability to create collaborative work environments between people. The leader has that responsibility. So I always reflect on, we need to reverse the vision of that org chart and recognize that's why leaders paid so much, is they have the weight of the people. It's not the job they're doing any longer. And I know you speak to that as well. It's the responsibility of running a team or helping an organization to develop. And so, the part of role clarity that I focus on is, yes, identifying goals is a huge part of a leader's role, and setting the direction of the team, helping them know how to get there, giving them the mentoring, the information, the connections, the tools, what have you, to get to that goal. But the third part, which most leaders in my experience have no knowledge of as their responsibility, is to remove the obstacles to success. And one of the biggest obstacles to success is interpersonal and team conflict. It can also come from outside of the team. It can be something like changing to a hybrid or remote work environment overnight, as many people had to do 2.5 years ago. But the ultimate purpose is removing those obstacles is the leader's responsibility. And conflict is one of the biggest obstacles.
It's interesting you described that inversion of the org chart. I mean, that is square in the playbook of servant leadership. That's exactly the picture of the org chart that they profess and encourage people to consider. And personally, I, for one, do agree with that. I am a big advocate of the so-called servant leader mindset, and that is to think of the needs of the team and be the power and the source that can remove roadblocks. You can set the way forward. You can cast the vision and give people the direction they might need for the clarity they need to do their job. And I like what you also said about the role definition there. There's a big piece of my work I do with leaders to remind them that creating clarity is one of their biggest challenges, because there's an old saying, a confused mind says no. And if your work team, any member of your work team, is not crystal clear on what their role may be and the guide rails that they can operate in, they're going to hold back. They're not going to necessarily do things wrong intentionally, but since they don't know what right looks like or what success looks like, they're going to hold back. And so if you're a manager and you look out there and you say, well, I've got half my team that is not working well, probably you have not set the clear vision and given them the clarity they need to know what their good job should be.
Right. And if I might, I would say, and this is where it diverges for me to both the looking at the trust and the looking at the conflict, because when people don't know, accountability drops and that leads to conflict. We know that people start feeling that. But part of it also is a leader needs to develop the trust with the people on the team to be able to say, and with themselves, to be able to say, I don't understand. I need to verify if I'm making the right choices and to feel safe in doing that. That concept of psychological safety is really profound in that if you do not have a team environment and a leadership style that builds trust up, and I'm not talking about simple honesty, it's far deeper than that. I would say honesty is the lowest rung on the trust ladder. It's expected. That's the basic. It's all the things beyond that create real trust. You're not going to have a team that can openly offer support and wisdom as well as critique and feedback to make everybody better. And we all want to be better. All of us, like I said, those leaders would always say, oh, of course, I know I'm part of the problem. If you start a team by saying, we all have things we're not as good at, everybody's going to nod their head. Yes, of course, there are things I'm not as good at as somebody else on the team. You just need to make it safe for people to own where they're strong and where they're not, and to tell somebody who might be seemingly more powerful, hey, I know this better than you. Let me explain. Just as well as to say, I don't know this as well as you do. I need your support.
I agree 100% and with everything you've said so far. And one of the big challenges that I find, particularly in big business and even on the entrepreneurial front, people get into that role of being in the case of the entrepreneur, the owner or the leader, and they've really not had any formal training. In big business, we have this weird, twisted tradition of needing to fill a supervisory job. So we look out on the shop floor and we pick the best producer and we say, poof, you're the supervisor. And there's no training, no assessment of potential. Oftentimes not even a real discussion about the role and the expectations and the appetite for doing it. And I'm overstating that a little bit, but my point is these people get into those roles and then, they slog through and they do an okay job. And what happens? They get promoted and it happens again and again and again. And all of a sudden they're at a fairly senior level. And the big company says, oh, we better get you some management training or we better get you some leadership development work. And it's like, yeah, but you've already had 15 years of influence on this business. And what habits have you developed? What mindsets have become ingrained with you? And now we're going to try to change all that.
And let's not forget, they're also modeling that behavior to everyone beneath them.
Exactly.
And then those people think, based on whether they liked it or not, based on whether or not they have the, mental ability to stretch their mind beyond what they were experiencing, to probably follow suit on that wrong path.
Because the conclusion is, well, if they made it to VP doing that, then that's what I need to do to be a VP.
Sadly, yes.
and you're right. And that's part of the legacy of that mindset. Well, we've got a lot to continue on with, Candice. We're going to take a short break, and we're going to continue this discussion right after this message.
Business is all about solving complex problems as fast as you can create them. Become the best problem solver by leading others to greatness too. And the first step is going to DougThorpe.com. Doug Thorpe is known globally for coaching entrepreneurs and business leaders, improving their performance and the work output of everyone surrounding them. You can find health, wealth, and happiness by learning to lead others to health, wealth, and happiness. Go to DougThorpe.com now and order Doug's books or hire him to coach your managers. That's DougThorpe.com.
Hello again, everyone. We're back, and today I'm talking with Candice Gottlieb-Clark. We are talking about the significant role that leaders have in creating the proper environment and the relationships within their teams. We danced around and dropped the T word in the first half of the show. The word is trust. And it is a popular concept now after Google dropped their big study on psychological safety, or at least that was the outcome of the study in determining high performing teams over other teams. Candice, you've got an acronym, I think, about trust. You tell us what that is.
Absolutely. And I would actually like to break down the acronym, but it's THOR. And we'll talk about THOR in just a minute. And I did, have that acronym before the wonderful new movie came out. But it stands for transparency, honesty, openness, and respect. And let me break those down. Honesty, as I mentioned just a bit ago, is the lowest rung on the trust ladder. We sort of just default to thinking being honest is all we need to do. But transparency is one of the most important parts. And that does not mean transparency with telling people your personal business. It means transparency with the knowledge they need to do the job, transparent about where you're strong and where you're weak, which comes back to what we were also talking about before the break. Transparency about what connections you have, what ability you have to help, where you're confused, where you want to team with other people. All those things. And it includes where you're maybe not able to be accountable, perhaps because something's not going right. So being transparent. Honesty, we talked about briefly, and it doesn't require much more verbiage than what we've said, but openness. Openness is almost the flip side of that transparency. It's taking in what people give you, taking in that feedback with an open mind and an open heart. And this is not just the team, this is the leader as well. When the team receives transparency, they're going to want to reciprocate that. And you need to be open to what is shared with you, where you might need help, where you might not have as much knowledge or ability to perform, or where you just maybe need to step back for a moment and look at a different way of handling a situation or a process. And then, of course, respect, meaning that if you don't demonstrate respect throughout all of that, treat people in a very positive and respectful way, that you say, hey, I understand you have knowledge. I understand you have skills. Let me add to those, as opposed to let me cut you down. When you have that as well, respect, you can then create that level of true trust because you've created that safety. And the acronym THOR works so well because Thor is known as the Norse god who created storms, but also was known for safety with his mighty hammer. And so what I remind my readers and listeners is to say that if you have THOR, if you have that transparency, the honesty, the openness and respect, you create safety and power. And if you fail in any of those, you will create storms.
Yeah. That's, I'm going to play devil's advocate for a minute. That all sounds wonderful, but I got a job to do. And,
okay.
I've got all these people, and every once in a while, I just have to tell somebody, we got to quit talking. We just got to get busy and get it done. And I know that's a mindset that is probably flawed at best. And it is something that needs to be overcome. I think it becomes the convenient excuse for managers not to work in these areas. And I am always challenged with that when I go out and I'm talking to executives and team leaders and things. They hear all this, they understand it intellectually, but then when it comes time to face the team and try to get some of this affected, they stumble and fall with it. So it becomes a repetition exercise to try to learn how to do it well.
I agree. And I think the only answer I have to that is to say, keep trying, because I find, the leaders that I work with and even people at management and supervisory levels often end up having a conversation with me that lends itself to my teaching them how to have what we call a difficult conversation. And in its core, difficult conversation is one we don't want to have. It's uncomfortable for us. It's difficult for us. It's usually less difficult for the recipient than it is for the deliverer. Sure. And it's that same thing. And it's simply to start. And by setting your intention with your team and saying, I'm coming out of my comfort zone and speaking to you differently to look at how we can be more effective as a team. Just own the discomfort, own the fact this is new, own the fact you're stumbling. Right there, you're demonstrating transparency. And it allows the team to have some awareness and forgiveness for you as you're doing that. And, have a list of maybe things you're going to make sure to ask and questions you're going to make sure to pose to kind of draw out the team. And just start. It's not going to be perfect, and it doesn't have to be. Transparency doesn't mean you're perfect. In fact, it means the opposite. It means you're owning where you're not.
Well, and in the spirit of transparency, I think it's always wise for a leader to volunteer to undergo a 360 review on a regular basis, because you can stand in front of a team meeting all you want to and ask for feedback. You're not always going to get it. And that's just a fact of human nature. But if you allow a quasi-anonymous, feedback loop to poll your constituents and allow them input, then you can earnestly say, thank you. I embrace this. I may not be happy about what I heard, but okay, I get it. I see how this is possible. And I'm reminded just recently, I've had an engagement with a large global brand, and I have about 25 of their leaders that have been going through a 360 kind of evaluation. And from that, they were challenged to develop a 3-part leadership development plan and taking their feedback. And I got to say, and I think this statistic probably holds true at large, out of 25 executives, I had one that was pretty upset about the feedback he got. I mean, as in, this is not fair. I know why this was said. This has to be a certain individual that has a grudge, blah, blah, blah. But the other 24 never mentioned anything like that. They just said, ooh, I don't want to be that way. I don't want to do it that way. I want to be different. I want to fill that gap. Help me decide what I need to do in my leadership development plan to make this better.
Mm-hmm.
And so statistically, I was pretty encouraged by that. And it was a very unscientific study, but 1 out of 25 took that feedback and, was not probably going to do very well with it, quite frankly. But the other 24, I think, are going to make great strides and really become better leaders because of it.
Yeah. And I very much agree. Talking about the template for trust and for developing a team, it is helpful to have the baseline. When you have the book, you don't get the 360 with it. But I 100% agree. And a lot of the projects that we do have a similar positioning of doing that quasi 360, where we give the leaders their feedback, much as you say, and we often will do some work and then do a second one to see what kind of momentum have they been able to create. I'm guessing you do something similar.
Yeah. Usually in my longer engagements, we always do that. We create that baseline up front, and depending on the length of the engagement, we may even have a midpoint as well as the final to try to see what the progression tracking is. Because let's face it, if we can't create results in these exercises to help do leadership coaching and team development and all of that, then we're wasting everybody's time. So we need to identify some tangible outcomes that we see as a result of the effort. Is there can you share a case study without breaking the confidence on something that you found in a situation and how you were able to kind of push through that?
Yeah, absolutely. And in my book, I use some stories. So I'll use one of the stories in there. They're real, but I anonymize them so that,
Sure.
my wonderful leaders that I worked with do not feel vulnerable. One of them, who I refer to as Josephine, she worked in the company from the day it began. She helped to establish it. It grew quite a bit, and she ended up VP of operations, overseeing many departments and a large number of people, as you can imagine. And she had such a passion for the business that she sort of took on almost what I would refer to as the mother hen behavior. And she oversaw things to a point where it was micromanaging, but she didn't want to be micromanaging. So it was a resistance. She knew she needed to keep building and growing this wonderful business she was so proud to be a part of. And yet she ended up creating a situation where people felt they had to get her approval on every step of the way. And so on the days she was in the office, there would be a legitimate line out her door of people doing that. And when we worked with her and we did that initial 360, and it was a team 360 to determine where else there were issues. And there were many issues between individuals on the team, and there was a large issue that stemmed back to her. And it was really an interesting conversation because everything that I learned, even though it was speaking to all her flaws and managing conflict or doing poorly at that, as was the case, she was creating situations where it seemed like there was favoritism and other things of that nature. At the core of it all was that she was overwhelmed and was trying to do things quickly and not explaining her reasons. And as a result, it was creating this, do as I say, not as I do behavior. And it snowballed on itself, and it created more and more friction. And in the end, when we did this Team 316, everyone got their own individual feedback of how they were not really working well and so forth. And we brought them all together. And just by luck, Josephine couldn't make it on time that day. She got stuck in traffic. Based in Los Angeles, we all know how that can happen in Los Angeles. And she was late. And I said, well, we're going to start without you because this time is precious. And about 15, 20 minutes into it, we realized we're going to be better without her here, because the team ultimately needed to work with each other, not how she could stay in charge of them. And so she arrived, she steps into the conference room, and I kicked her out. And she was a bit, flummoxed, like, oh my gosh, you're kicking me out of my own team meeting. And I said, we don't need you yet. We'll bring you back when we need you. And it, to this day, that was over a decade ago, transformed the way that team worked. They learned how to work with each other because they already learned where they weren't strong, where they weren't performing in a way that was cohesive with the rest of the team, because she wasn't there protecting people from each other and mother henning and then deciding on things. It forced them to learn their own path together. And then she could do what she needed to do, which is grow the business and just oversee the main important things, helping to set the direction and, of course, removing the hurdles.
That's amazing. And it reminds me of the kind of thing you might call evolution of leadership. If you're listening and you're kind of on your own leadership journey with opportunities in your career progression or in your own business, there will be inflection points where you need to seriously consider a change for yourself that has to do with the way you look at the business, with the way you operate, and so forth. In the small business realm, I call it moving from founder to CEO. And there are some major decisions that have to get made about how you want to look at the business and your willingness to make the move as the business grows. I had a guest recently on this show that told a story of a founder, CEO of a startup that had done quite well and had progressed, and the company was growing nicely. And one day, one of the team members came and said, "Hey, boss, can we all take a break and let's go down and have a coffee? Let's go down the street and have a coffee." And the boss goes, "That's great. We're doing good. Yeah, shut it down, everybody. Let's go have coffee." So he thought they were just going to have a nice time. Well, truly, it was a planned intervention. The team had come together and said, if we're going to keep growing, the boss needs to change some things. There's some things he's doing that we need different. And they had banded together and they presented him with a bit of a manifesto of what they needed. He was micromanaging, he was overburdening certain people, ignoring others, and all that. They had a whole list of things. And fortunately, he had the emotional intelligence to sit back and go, "Tell me more," and mean it. He said, "Tell me more. I'm ready and willing. I believe in you. I believe in what we're doing here. Tell me more." And they had this wonderful exchange. And talk about back to your Thor model. He was transparent and honest and open, and he went after it, with all sincerity. And in the cases where there was something he didn't do, he actually went out and hired leaders and managers to fill in gaps that had emerged in the company that he could not perform. And fabulous success story, but that was on him, and it speaks volumes to his effectiveness as a leader.
And I would add to it his effectiveness before that moment, which allowed the team to know they could talk to each other.
You're great.
And whether he hired well or groomed them well, people don't naturally have the ability to come together that way unless somebody has led them in that culture.
Yep.
So he had given something that was strong in the beginning that really was profoundly helpful to creating the environment where these people could come together and start being honest with one another and transparent and open about their views, not fearful that somebody's going to tattle on them.
Yeah. Yeah. No, you're right. And that is a very good point, that there had already obviously been a reasonably healthy culture where people could exchange those ideas openly and realize they did have a common thought or common spirit about where they wanted to go with that business. And if you think about it, they were already bought in to the idea that we got a good thing here. We want to keep it going. And if we have a roadblock in the boss, we need to go approach him and see if we can work through that too.
Yeah.
So you're right. That's a kind of a win-win all the way around. But I think my point in bringing that up, back to the individuals who may be listening that are in those roles of authority, please think about Candice's store model, that transparent, honest, open, and what was the R word? Responsive? Respect. Yeah. Absolutely. Having that, don't be threatened by the feedback you get, but use it as rocket fuel. I mean, take the challenge and work the gap, see what you can do with it.
Very true.
Well, Candice, if anybody is listening and interested in getting in touch with you, tell us the best way to do that.
Oh, well, that would be terrific. I would love that. I have a LinkedIn page, as I think everybody would expect, and it's CandiceGottlieb-Clark.com or at LinkedIn. And then I have my business, which is Dynamic Team Solutions, 3 words, but all together, .org. And they can find me there. There's some wonderful free resources, including a way to link to 2 free chapters of my book. And my book, Find, Fix, Fill Your Leadership Gap, is available on Amazon.
That's awesome. We will have all of that information in the show notes if you didn't catch it on the fly here or the flash during the video. And speaking of that, I want to remind everybody, if you're listening to this show on your favorite streaming channel, we do have a video version of this over on YouTube under the channel page by the same name, Leadership Powered by Common Sense. I really want to encourage everybody, if you are in one of these leadership roles, you've heard today some great advice and some great thinking from Candice and her work with helping leaders really influence and impact the relationships among their team. And any of us who have ever been in that role know what a huge challenge that is. You fundamentally don't know what you're going to get when you hire somebody, just to be really transparent about that. You can do your best in vetting and screening and testing and all of that, but you don't really know what personality is going to show up for work on Monday until you really see them arrive and get to know them. Hopefully you made a reasonably good choice in bringing that person onto your team and that they can properly assimilate. But if there's any bumps in the road, you need to be ready and willing to dive into it, lean into it, and take care of it. Build that culture and build that respect. So, Candice, any final thoughts?
I want to encourage leaders and aspiring leaders to know that books, yours, mine, others, are really a wonderful place to get the information, even if you're not receiving training. Very often, as you've already articulated, companies don't have the foresight or even the knowledge of who to send someone to for the appropriate training. I think learning and taking in things and not just expecting that you're going to get what you need on the job is the best way to be a strong, powerful leader. And that's what, of course, we both want to see.
Amen. And thank you for that. So with that, everybody, we're going to sign off for this episode, and thank you for listening. And Candice, one last time, thank you so much for being here.
Thank you. I really appreciate it, Doug.
All right, everybody. Thank you for listening in. We hope to see you again real soon, and take care. Make it a great day. Bye-bye.
You've been listening to Leadership Powered by Common Sense, hosted by Doug Thorpe. If you would like to know more about the coaching and advisory services he provides, visit DougThorpe.com.